Welcome, everybody. I know some of you are still collecting your lunch. There are a bunch of seats scattered around, so please grab something to eat, have a seat. We're going to get started because I know everybody's time is precious and we want to get going. I'm Bill Squadron, and I'd like to welcome everybody here on behalf of our Energy Policy Foundation. I'm going to turn it over just for a minute to Brian Scretany. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this with the Oil and National Security Caucus. I want to particularly thank Congressman Engel in Kingston and the caucus as a whole for working with us. And Brian and Mike Donnell have been really great in coordinating with us to put on the event today. So I'm going to turn it over quickly to Brian, and then we're going to get started.
Thank you, Bill. Very briefly, I am Brian Scretany with Congressman Eliot Engel. He's a Democrat from New York. Sitting in the second row here is Mike Donnell. He's with Jack Kingston, a Republican from Georgia. Together, those two members co-chair the Oil and National Security Caucus. We are a bipartisan group of members dedicated to breaking our dependence on foreign oil and examining the national security implications of doing so. So we are putting this panel on with Bill Squadron and the ourenergypolicy.org group. He can introduce the panel, but I wanted to just say that if any of your members are interested in joining us and joining our caucus, please see me or see Mike during or after this event. We'd love to have you on. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So for those of you who are familiar with ourenergypolicy.org, you already know that what we're leading into today is a very lively and spirited discussion, which is really what we're all about, which is creating a nonpartisan platform for a serious discussion on an ongoing basis across the whole range of the critical energy policy issues that our country is facing. And the goal really is not to do it as an exercise in and of itself, but really to create a resource for many of you in this room who are working on these issues, and to use these discussions and the consensus that sometimes can build out of them, or the innovative ideas that grow out of them, to help inform the work you're doing in addressing some of these policy issues. So I'd urge all of you, if you're not already regularly participating at ourenergypolicy.org, please do so. We've got some material about it, so please grab something if you don't have it already, and we welcome your participation in that discussion. The other thing which I wanted to be sure everybody knew about is that we've recently introduced a very comprehensive library on our site. It's in the resources section. So for anyone that's looking for information, whether it's reports, articles, papers, studies, and even legislation, on any energy topic, this will be a go-to destination for you to find really the most comprehensive repository of materials on energy policy. So we hope you'll be able to use it, and it'll be valuable for you and something that will help you as you do your work going forward. So we have a terrific panel today. It's going to be a very interesting discussion, I'm sure, and I'm not going to go into the lengthy backgrounds of all these people because, as you might imagine, that would take up most of the hour, but we have a great group. To my far right is Rob Barnett, who is a senior energy analyst at Bloomberg Government and was previously Associate Director of Climate Change and Clean Energy at IHS Cambridge Energy Research Associates. To his immediate left is R. James Woolsey. Jim Woolsey, many of you know as one of the most renowned national security and energy experts in the country, previously Director of Central Intelligence, Undersecretary of the Navy, General Counsel to the Senate Committee on the Armed Services. He's currently chairman of Woolsey Partners and a partner at Vantage Point Venture Partners, and he's a frequent contributor to major publications and to the media on subjects of national defense, energy, and energy security. And then to his left is Ken Green, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's an environmental scientist by training. His research focuses on policy and regulation involving energy and the environment. And Ken is one of the most prolific writers in this area that I know. You can find him regularly blogging at AEI's Enterprise blog. He also recently published his second textbook on a guide to energy and energy policy, which is designed for the collegiate audience. So I'm now going to turn it over to Yossi Hollander, who is chairman of our Energy Policy Foundation and ourenergypolicy.org, and he will moderate the panel. Yossi?
Good afternoon. Welcome to this event. The purpose of this event is discussion and questions. First, each one of the panelists will present like a 5-minute view of the world on this area, I hope, only. And then try to argue a little bit with each other. I'll ask a few questions, let them raise it. Maybe they'll even agree. Who knows? That sometimes happens. But then we'll turn it also to you. So we'll leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. And just one thing is, as we get to ask questions, we are recording this, we'll also get a mic. So please be aware of that. We can't hear you and we can't record. The whole session will later on be both on video and in transcript on the website. So if people are interested and want to show people something and want to refer them to something, they can do that. So with that in mind, I will start from the right.
Great.
Rob?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I think energy security is a very interesting topic, partly because I think if you asked everyone on this panel to define it, you'd get a different answer. Does it mean low prices? Does it mean insulation from global events? Does it mean zero energy imports? What about exports? What is the appropriate level of imports? What is the appropriate price? I mean, all of these kinds of questions, I think, enter the debate. At Bloomberg Government, I think we'd frame the discussion around good data. We talk a lot about supply and demand, and I think price would ultimately fall out of that. So chat with you a couple minutes to kick things off about prices, supply, and demand. On the price side, I think that's really why we're having the discussion. When energy prices are low, they don't enter the national debate very much. Right now, prices, especially for oil and gasoline, are pretty much at record highs. During 2011, we saw the highest average retail gasoline price in the United States ever. It was $3.58 a gallon on average across the country. And 2012 is actually on track to be even higher. The current average year-to-date is $3.78. We're actually a little below that in terms of an average right now across the country. But we're at all-time highs, and so that's why folks are talking about this. And families and households really bear a lot of that cost. In 2011, the average household spent $2,600 on gasoline. That's about 4% of a typical household budget, and if you look back just a decade ago, it was more like $1,000 per household. So we've seen rapid escalation in the amount that folks are spending on energy, and I think that that's really what's driving the conversation. Now, in terms of government, I don't think the government's in the business of setting prices in most cases. So really, the tools of government would focus on supply and demand. On the demand side, I would emphasize that things change very slowly typically. There are 245 million cars on the road in the United States right now. And in any given year, we sell 15 to 20 million new cars, and that's when the economy is going well. We didn't sell that many last year, probably won't sell that many this year. So it takes a long time to turn over the vehicle stock. And so when you think about fuel economy standards that the government has been pushing to help lower oil demand, while they can be effective, it's going to take a lot of time. You've heard the the top line number, 55 miles per gallon. That's where cars need to get to by 2025. And by the way, there's a lot of caveats and flexibility with that rule, so we won't actually get quite there, but it's not going to radically transform the amount of oil we consume here in the United States. We've done a series of analyses at Bloomberg Government and show that the fuel economy standards might reduce oil demand by about 600,000 barrels per day. We consume 19 million barrels per day currently. That's by 2025. The renewable fuel standard could also put downward pressure on oil demand. That alone could reduce oil by about 1 million barrels per day, but there's a big if you're actually going to hit the RFS. So I think all of these policies really, the big takeaway is that they move slowly, and you got to think in terms of decades before you see a real movement on the needle. I think on the supply side, it's very similar. Things change slowly. That being said, there's a lot of momentum here in the United States for new supplies right now. Just like shale natural gas has transformed the natural gas market here in the United States, we're seeing shale oil or tight oil really transform U.S. oil markets. And in the last 4 years, we've increased oil production by 1.1 million barrels per day. This is a very staggering number. Oil production in the U.S. in March was at its highest level since 1993. So I think for those who look at and think about kind of peak oil kind of things, I think we've seen technology really reverse some trends in the oil market. U.S. is the third largest oil producer currently. We could possibly become the number one. We fall behind Saudi Arabia and Russia right now. But that shouldn't get folks who are thinking about gas prices too excited, because the United States only produces about 10% of the global oil supply. So even if we have a large increase in oil production here in the U.S., I mean, let's say we add an additional 1 million barrels per day, that's only going to add 1% to global supplies. So I think you can't necessarily drill your way out of the energy security problem, because we can't drill enough oil here in the United States to sort of satiate the needs of countries like China, India, Brazil that have rapidly growing energy demands. That's not to say domestic supply isn't important, but unlikely to flip the balance in a substantive way. So to conclude, oil prices are important. But there's little politicians can probably do in the short run. They can do a lot in the long run, however, and but you've got to be thinking in terms of decades or even generations when you think about energy. I'll pass it over to Jim.
Jim first. Thank you. Oil needs a competitor.
It's on.
It's on? Now, okay. Oil needs a competitor. If you ask the question, who sets the price of gasoline, the answer is 8 nations in the Middle East, 2 in South America, and 2 in sub-Saharan Africa, and also known as OPEC. How can I say that? Obviously, a market operates at the fringes, and because of disagreements between Saudi Arabia and Iran about whether we ought to have $90 or $100, $110 barrel oil, there's some variance, and there are a few factors at the margins that affect things other than OPEC. But basically, oil has a monopoly over transportation in the world, about a 95% monopoly. And OPEC has about 80% of the world's provable reserves of conventional oil. Furthermore, some of the OPEC nations can lift oil more cheaply than virtually anybody else. Saudi Arabia, for example, it's under $5 a barrel. And OPEC is pumping about the same amount of oil today that it was pumping 40 years ago in 1972 on the eve of the Yom Kippur War and all of the price escalation. It's gone down in the meantime, but it hasn't gone above what it is essentially now. Now, if you are an institution that controls 80% of something and you only permit a third of the market to be OPEC oil every year, year after year after year, and if you are pumping the same amount that you pumped 40 years ago when the world's economy was about half what it is now, and the world's demand for oil was half or less than it is now, I submit there is only one thing that you can reasonably be called, and that is a conspiracy and restraint of trade, otherwise known as a cartel. So we do not have a free market in oil in the United States. We have the trap in the world. We have the trappings of some, but we don't have a free market. And the first thing we have to decide in order to decide on policy is whether we want to live with that cartel or do something to get out of its grip. I have 3 quotes here. I'm going to pass these out so people can have them, about monopolies. And it's by 3 interesting people. I hope particularly Ken is interested in this. First, quote, "The first and most urgent necessity in the area of government policy is the elimination of those measures which directly support monopoly." Sounds like an activist, right? Second, our freedom of choice in a competitive society rests on the fact that if one person refuses to satisfy our wishes, we can turn to another. But if we face a monopolist, we are at his mercy. And the third quote, the monopolists, by keeping the market constantly understocked by never fully supplying the effectual demand, sell their commodities much above the natural price and raise their emoluments, whether they consist in wages or profit, greatly above their natural rate. All three of these guys sounds like real activists who want to go after these cartels, these monopolies. First quote is from Milton Friedman. The second quote is from Friedrich Hayek. And the third quote is from Adam Smith. Not exactly the left wing with respect to how to deal with markets. The first and biggest and most important job of a government is to end cartels. How can we do that? We'll get to that a bit later. But oil has to have a competitor. One competitor that has opened up within the last few years, in no small measure because of the brilliance and the stubbornness of a now 91-year-old gas man in Houston named George Mitchell, who put together horizontal drilling and hydrofracturing and has almost single-handedly come up with the ideas that have radically increased the world's supply of natural gas. The reason that's important is that natural gas at $2 a million BTUs, roughly where it is now, is about 8 times cheaper than $100 a barrel oil, and it's 10 times cheaper than $120 a barrel oil, where oil was until very recently. That means that as a feedstock for chemicals, for alcohol fuels, for other purposes, natural gas has a huge advantage once we get the infrastructure adapted over oil in cost terms. But what we have now is a blockage against our being able to use natural gas-based fuels to drive on. That blockage is the fact that although you and I are not addicted to oil, our cars are. They cannot run on anything else. That has come about over the years for various reasons, but it is the reason why you cannot be as smart and shrewd as a Brazilian. You cannot pull into a filling station and see alternative fuels and decide which one you want to buy. You have to buy the oil-based fuel. In Brazil, they use ethanol. It's cheap to make down there. But what we need is more choice for fuels in the U.S., including the ability to use some natural gas-based fuels and to make that change relatively quickly. We can talk about this, but the infrastructure changes that are required to do that vary from the small to the negligible. And with that, I'll pass it on to Ken.
Thanks, Jim. As you might have gathered, I'm probably going to be the contrarian here today. First, though, before I get to my actual sort of prepared remarks, a word on monopolies. I'm not sure why Jim thinks that I like them. Monopolies are bad, absolutely no question about it. And in fact, we use force to break up monopolies within our jurisdiction, within the country. The force of government is, it's actually one of the cardinal functions of government. When you're dealing with other jurisdictions and other countries and other sovereignties, however, the logical implication there is that you would actually go to war with them over a monopoly, which I don't think that people have a stomach for going to war with Saudi Arabia and everybody else to break the OPEC monopoly, which is why we still have them. But, I mean, there's no question monopolies are bad. So with that, I'll get into my prepared comments. Yossi asked a couple of questions in email, and being a good conservative sort of cooperative fellow, I decided to answer them. He asked, what are the implications of the new natural gas boom? What about the Arab Spring? Can we drill our way out of energy insecurity? Where are oil prices headed and their national security impact and the use of alternate fuels by the DOD? I'm going to stay away from the Arab Spring. I'm not a foreign policy person at AEI, and Danny Pletka might have my head. So, but I will address the other issues momentarily. I have to say, I've always felt that arguments regarding energy that are grounded in the ideas of energy security and energy independence are of dubious merit. And I think recent developments in terms of the massive upsurge of production of new unconventional fuels shows how badly we would have done had we listened to the people who wanted to channel U.S. policy in the direction of syn fuels, alcohol fuels, and the like, in terms of having spent far more than we need to spend and being reliant on fuels that have a poorer environmental and performance portfolio than we are going to have in another 10 years or so. The only way that we are threatened when it comes to energy is that when the world oil price spikes, the U.S. tends to go into a recession. We are completely secure in the fuels needed to generate electricity. We have, in fact, hundreds of years of supply right here. We are completely secure in virtually all other ways. We are also somewhat insecure in the fact that if somebody manages to detonate a nuclear warhead and an electromagnetic pulse, it's the end of civilization as we know it. I don't think we're going to be able to answer that threat here today. But really, that's the main threat, is that oil price spikes and the economy goes into recession. And that's bad, no question. The problem is the only real answer to that is complete electrification of your transportation system, which is not technologically or economically feasible at this time. Any other liquid fuel, and this is something I don't understand why this isn't, why people don't understand this. Any other liquid fuel you make will rise to the world price of its energy equivalent immediately. Because fuels are fungible. They can move. You can put them in tankers and sell them to other markets. Unless you actually have restraint of trade, which trade, by the way, is a good thing. We actually are a net petroleum product exporter this year, and will be for 2 more years, as I'll get to in a minute. Unless you're going to impose trade restraints, which violate various trade agreements, the energy equivalent of a liquid fuel is going to rise to the world price. And I'm not quite sure, I'm not sure which society Jim's living in, but I could go out tomorrow and buy a vehicle and convert it to natural gas. I know people who have electric cars and have had them now for 15 years. There are conversion kits available to turn your car to drive it on propane, natural gas, electricity if you really want to. The market has rejected these technologies routinely. Now, next year, I believe 2 car companies are coming out with stock vehicles that can be had as natural gas vehicles. And with the price of natural gas, and several other companies have announced the adoption of natural gas for their trucking fleets. And at least one company, oil company, has plans to put natural gas refueling stations at over 100 truck stops across the country, all of which will dramatically accelerate the adoption of natural gas for transportation fuel. But as Rob said, you can't overestimate the speed with which the trucking fleet can turn over. The production of heavy diesel vehicles are expensive, the engines are expensive. They have to amortize their return on their initial investment before they change over to natural gas. And it takes time to do these things. So we have a lot of trucks, right? I'm going to the few quick questions, then I'll turn it over to discussion. What are the implications of the natural gas boom? I think it's rewriting the entire global energy narrative from one of future scarcity to one of potential abundance. The locations of the new sources of fuel that are coming online, tight oil and gas, threaten to overturn the strategic nature that so bothers Jim and bothers many other people, because they're not in the same locations. These are not being found in the OPEC countries. They're being found largely outside the OPEC countries, and in fact in free countries, more so than in dictatorial regimes. And this, of course, presumes the environmental movement doesn't manage to mess this up, by imposing absurd regulations on hydraulic fracturing. I actually don't think that's going to happen. I think they're so far behind the ball, and they are so desperate not to have another economic recession that they're going to be unable to rein in the shale gas boom or stop Canada's tar sand expansions. Can we drill our way out? Well, some would say we already have. The U.S. was, as I said, was a net oil exporter last year. Petroleum products. According to the EIA, the U.S. will ship abroad 350,000 barrels a day more petroleum products than it imports in 2012, and 320,000 barrels daily in 2013. That represents significant gains in trade. British BP, beyond petroleum, yeah, in its energy outlook, predicts total North American energy self-sufficiency by the year 2030. Where are oil prices headed? Well, ask me after the euro collapses, but Right now, some analysts are actually worried that if oil keeps trending down and breaks the $70 price point, that it might not hit the bottom until 45 a barrel. That's partly because of economic recession. It's also partly because of increased supplies and here and abroad. And now, of course, if the euro drags the world back into a deep recession, you could easily see that happen again. So the people saying, you know, you'll never see the bottom of $100 barrel oil were never right, and they could actually be eating their words at $20 barrel oil, which would be temporary. And of course, we always assume that oil prices will go back up because growth will resume. But you know, there are a lot of economists, some economists now thinking that this is actually the new normal for world economic growth. And that we won't return to where we were for a very long time, and that China itself has serious problems that could threaten its growth rates. And if that happens, your oil demand slackens significantly. So finally, the use of alternative fuels by the DoD was asked. I don't see the logic in raising your costs of operation when you're already strapped in your budget, you're canceling weapon programs, and you face massive across-the-board cuts. Why would you want to raise the cost of your fuels? The alternative fuels, as my friend David Kreutzer points out, are generally of less energy density than the fuels they're replacing. And you still have to produce them here and ship them. So you're not saving on your supply line risk, you're not saving on your supply line cost. You may be increasing your supply line risks, and you're increasing the overall cost of operations. This makes no sense. We have a strategic petroleum reserve that could power the entire country's supply for 2 months. And we've never really faced a serious supply interruption in the United States. During the '73 oil embargo, we did not have an oil shortfall. What we had were price controls that led people to drain gas stations dry and line up blocks to get gasoline. So with that, I will rest. I'm sure there will be some significant pushback from Jim and perhaps from all of you, and I welcome that, and let's have a conversation.
So instead of asking a question, I think some people are really want to answer something already. So why don't you go? No comment. No comments.
Okay. No, sure. Glad to.
Rob?
I'm delighted if Ken would sign on to doing whatever we need to break cartels and monopolies. I would sign on with Friedman Hayek and Adam Smith on this point. But if you sign on to that, you have to do something. And the only way to do this, and certainly is not declaring war on Saudi Arabia, is to have an alternative that is really available in the market and can really be used by today's cars. Not after some real long-term conversion and slow slope of only new cars having it, and not so-called energy independence, just pumping oil in the United States. That helps our balance of payments. It helps a little bit with employment, but it doesn't really do anything else. Britain was energy independent in 2008. It got about as much oil from the North Sea as it used. You know, in theory, Britain could have seceded from the world's oil market in 2008 when things went through the roof, but it didn't. Oil was $145 a barrel in Britain, just as it was every place else. There was a huge impact on diesel prices. There was a big truck driver strike all over Britain because of the cost of diesel. If Britain was energy independent, what was going on? The answer is because of the intricate nature of the modern oil market, the location of refineries, the nature of the investment structure, and so forth, you can't just switch in and out. If there's a war someplace that makes you feel nervous, you can't just start using your own oil or that from, say, Canada. And if you do, if we use more from Canada, bought more from Canada and less from Saudi Arabia because there's a crisis in the Middle East, somebody else is going to buy more from Saudi Arabia and less from Canada. There's basically one worldwide oil market. So one thing I would agree with Ken on is that what people usually call energy independence is a really, really, really stupid definition. What would be energy independence is having OPEC realize they can't drop the price on you. They can't drive other people out of business. Now, are they going to take oil down to 20? I kind of doubt it. The Saudis needed up around 80 or 90 in order to pay all their young men not to work the way they do. And the Russians needed up or close to 100 in order to pay all their young people not to work, which is kind of what they're doing too. A lot of oil states are very happy, in a sense, with their welfare programs that don't require anybody to actually take any new steps. But the thing I want to close with, I think it is absolutely not the case that the only way we are threatened is if oil prices spike and we have a recession. The only way we are threatened is by a spike and recession in a peaceful world. In a non-peaceful world, a world in which Al-Qaeda tries to take out Abqaiq, as it did a few years ago, the largest oil production facility in the world, in a world of the Straits of Hormuz, in a world in which autocracy and autocratic kingdoms and dictatorships are encouraged by what Paul Collier at Oxford calls the oil curse, the added amount of economic rent that goes to a country like Saudi Arabia when it lifts oil for under $5 a barrel and sells it for 80. All of that contributes to authoritarianism and dictatorial sustenance for the countries that are already like that. That's why 9 out of 10 of the largest world oil exporters are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. That's why the 20 states in the world that make 60% or more of their national income from oil and gas are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. So one of the many things we are contributing to by staying in thrall to oil is that we are sustaining that lifestyle of we'll pay our young men not to work, and in the meantime we'll dominate our people. That is not really something the United States ought to be willing to pay $1 billion a day, or to borrow $1 billion a day, actually, is what we do, in order to sustain. We borrow $1 billion a day to import oil. That amounts to a tax of about $4,000 per year on each American family of 4. And that $4,000 you're not paying to Richmond to build roads or to the U.S. to pay the Marine Corps. You're paying it into the Saudi treasury and into the Russian treasury and into the treasuries of everybody who exports oil. Even if you don't pay it directly, they're the ones who benefit. So if you really like funding Saudi young men not to work, and you really like paying that essentially set of taxes every year to OPEC and other oil exporters, then we should let oil have its continued free ride and not need to compete with anybody.
Jim, I want to jump in on the idea of natural gas as a competitive fuel in the transportation sector. I think I'm all for alternatives. I would maybe give a bit of caution on natural gas. Natural gas is at a decade low price right now. Oil, relatively high, all things being equal. And so I don't think that the current price relationship between oil and natural gas is one that you should probably peg for the long term. A lot of the natural gas producers are losing money. I think folks would expect prices to rise from certainly where they are today over time. And also, I think there are a lot of hurdles to adoption of natural gas vehicles. Right now, there are about 400 filling stations in the United States that sell compressed natural gas. There are 120,000 regular gasoline stations. So, there's problems of fueling infrastructure, which would obviously need to be solved. And then the vehicles themselves are actually more expensive. I think in terms of thinking about competitors to oil, it's a very good idea, and maybe natural gas is part of the portfolio, but I wouldn't make it the only piece. In an ideal world, you would want something that plugs and plays with our existing infrastructure. And I'm not the person who knows what that's going to be, but anything that can plug into the existing vehicle stock and provide a fuel source is highly attractive because the vehicle stock exists for so long.
Just a couple quick pushbacks. So this is going to, again, I'm with AEI, we're thought of as neocons, some people do. Are monopolies bad? Yes. Are the OPEC countries and dictatorial regimes bad? Yes. Do they and terrorists pose a threat to the United States or threats of various kinds to the United States? Yes. Would they pose those threats even if we weren't buying their oil? Are they going to hate us less because we give them less money and trade with them less? No. And would we improve our overall position by taking the kind of steps to create alternate fuels that are economically infeasible and uncompetitive? No. And so it comes down to, do I like these regimes? Absolutely not. I'd love to see them eat sand. But as my mother always said, don't cut off your nose to spite your face. And that's where we are in the reality of the world today. Taking the kind of steps to get off oil would essentially be cutting off our nose to spite our face.
I want to focus maybe a little bit on the economy side of that, the natural gas yes or no price. It seems to be, I think everybody is understanding now that the issue is not how much we import or export, actually it's the price. Because if oil was $5 a gallon and we imported it all, nobody would care. And if it was $200 a gallon and we produced it all, everybody would care. Because it's not about who produces, it's the price. So let's talk about, everybody talks about natural gas as a game changer. A couple of numbers, and then I'll throw the questions to you as a result of that. Okay. Last year, United States increased its natural gas production by 1.7 billion MCF. At current prices, that's just a little bit over $3.5 billion a year. Okay? If we took, just for example, not recommending any fuel, but if we took that amount of natural gas, converted it to methanol, we could replace, if we had the infrastructure and we had the car, I mean, with some ifs, but at least in terms of the price, we could have replaced 10 billion gallons of gasoline, which is $30 billion. So let's assume that we cut oil prices by half to, let's say, $50. We're now talking about gasoline prices, let's say, by half. So now we're at $15 billion. And let's assume that we double the gas prices to 7. We still got $8 billion margin out there that could be very profitable if we just did the transition. So my question to you, why isn't the transition not happening? Today we have something that costs 3.5 that potentially can replace something that is costing today 30. And even if they meet somewhere in the middle, it's still going to be a lower price for everybody. What is preventing the transition from happening?
A good rule.
Whoever wants to pick it up.
A good rule of thumb is that there's about the same amount of BTUs. A BTU, by the way, is a wooden match. Burn a wooden match and released about a BTU of heat. There are about the same number of BTUs in a million cubic feet of gas, natural gas, as there are in 6 barrels of oil. So if gas is 1 and oil is 6, they are equal energy basis. Well, today with gas at 3, oil should be about 18 if it's equal energy, but it's not. It's up in the 80s. So even though that's because of fracking, that's because of hydrofracturing. For many, many decades, oil and gas just tracked one another in that equivalent. When natural gas was 3, oil would be about 12, or it would be about 18. So because of hydrofracturing, you've got the possibility of having gas somewhere between a factor of 2 or 3 and 10 below oil in the price of its energy. What that opens up is the possibility, as Yossi suggested, not really necessarily of using natural gas, although it's a pretty easy thing to do to convert delivery trucks and buses and even interstate trucking. But it is more expensive than it needs to be for the family car. For vehicles, regular gasoline-powered family cars, methanol, as Yossi suggested, is a perfectly reasonable answer. Go down to the hardware store right now, methanol goes for about $1.05, $1.10 a gallon. It's all over the place. It's about a third of the windshield wiper fluid in your car. So Americans squirt millions of gallons of methanol on the road every time it rains, and what happens? It's an alcohol that evaporates. It's not a big deal. You can't drink it, whereas I suppose if you were really dedicated to getting drunk, you could drink ethanol, which is grain alcohol, 200 proof vodka. But people say methanol is poisonous. Well, yeah, but so is when's the last time you had a gasoline martini? So you're right, you don't want to drink it. But in terms, it's something that we've made for a couple of hundred years, maybe out of wood, and the American methanol business is based on natural gas now. And that opportunity to make minor changes to not only new but existing vehicles and use it is what presents itself here. There are 3 estimates I know of on how much it would cost for a new vehicle to be able to drive on methanol as well as gasoline. There is MIT's, which is $90 per car. There's General Motors's, which is $70 per car. And then it's my friend Robert Zubrin, who studies these matters and writes on them and does his own testing and so forth. His total is 41 cents per car, an O-ring. Somewhere, according to everybody, under $100 a car is what you're talking about for conversion and prices. And that begins to make it quite plausible to look toward seeing vehicles make you as shrewd as Brazilians and make it possible for you to choose, whereas today you cannot. OPEC and the car manufacturers have told you, you will drive on oil products. We are not giving you any other option. The objective is to break that tie and thereby to break OPEC.
Okay. Well, as Vaclav Smil, who's a very well-renowned researcher in energy, has pointed out repeatedly, and as Rob pointed out repeatedly, energy systems have a massive amount of momentum to them and inertia. And $8 billion, when we're talking about trillion-dollar stimulus packages and budgets, $8 billion is no longer a huge amount of money. But just a few of the challenges that we might want to talk about. As Rob said, if you look...
just the annual increase
Right.
in assumption of half. It's now 3.5 to 30 every
it
year.
Might fix
That's a big one.
That might fix California's budget. As Rob pointed out, historically, what wins are plug-and-play fuels. In fact, it turns out critical to Edison's electrification of homes were the fact that homes were already set up for natural gas, for gas lighting, and they could run the cords directly through the pipes, and they could put in a burner that was almost exactly the same as your gas burner, and it helped with led to people to be willing to adopt to new technologies. This is the normal trend. So you're thinking about methanol, and you think, well, supply, where are they going to put it? Gas stations have to install new tanks and new pumps, a major part of their cost, and they're already marginal businesses. The gas stations don't make a lot of the profit off of the gasoline they sell. The vehicles have to be, of course, get EPA certification and then comply with 50 state air pollution plants. And these things are slow. Each player involved has a very, very marginal incentive, profit incentive, to break with something that is only intermittently infuriating, right? Historically, until recently, the historic norm for oil was very, very low, and gas prices were not an issue. And they're an issue and they're annoying for certain periods of time, a couple of years in a row, and then they go away, and they come back and they go away. So the reason, the direct answer to your question, why don't we have this is the market, to the extent possible, has decided it's not a profitable pathway. Now, again, I can buy a flex fuel vehicle right now, and I can go to the hardware store Jim pointed out, Jim points me to, and I can buy my methanol, right? But technically speaking, I'm not sure it's actually legal to put methanol in your flex fuel vehicles yet, and the EPA represents a significant hurdle to this.
I want to go and continue, Rob, and actually directed to you. Wall Street is a big player in all this, okay? And there's money to be made. Those gaps between natural gas prices, the disconnect between oil and gas, which I think all around this table agree is probably with us for a considerable time. By the way, anywhere where you drill for tight oil, like in the back end, you get 70% gas. Almost every hole that is drilled around the world right now is gas, not oil. So we're probably in the gas century, at least from hydrocarbon point of view. So everybody knows what's coming. Why is financing not pouring into this area and say, let's invest in companies to convert cars, to do maybe diesel, to do all kinds of other stuff? You would expect with that amount of dollars, okay, we're just talking about, we could actually double the amount of gas in the United States growth if we had a market for it right now. So it's not just what the market it is right now, because we don't want to produce more gas. There's a lot of dry holes that are just drilled and not pumped because there's too much gas. Where is Wall Street? There's so much money to be made. It's $1 trillion industry that we can change. Why are they not entering the game?
I think it just all comes down to allocation of capital, and folks on Wall Street and folks in big business chase high returns. And frankly, if oil price is $100 a barrel, it's drilling oil wells is actually quite profitable in a lot of instances. It's not profitable at every type of production site you might look at. To add to your point, compressed natural gas sells for about $2 per gallon gasoline equivalent. Gasoline is, say, $3.60 right now. But as Jim mentioned, the wholesale price for natural gas is actually much, much cheaper than that. So there's huge margin to be made for folks who are in that distribution business. But it's a big chicken and egg problem, frankly, because I think the folks who would potentially sell these kind of fuels have to invest in infrastructure. CNG infrastructure, you pay $350,000 to $1 million for a CNG fueling station. For a conventional gasoline fueling station, you're talking about $50,000 to $150,000. So if you're the seller in this case, do you want to invest in that for a fuel that very few are likely to buy? On the flip side, if you're a consumer and you're thinking about buying one of these vehicles that could run on these alternative fuels, I think you're thinking, well, do I want to buy this vehicle and not have the guarantee that I can take a road trip with my family? And so I think right now you really have to look in some ways to government to provide incentives if you want to see capital allocated differently, because I think the market outcome is basically what we have now.
Jim?
CNG conversions are expensive, which is why everybody is suggesting that you use CNG for fleet vehicles like delivery trucks and buses. And some say CNG, some say LNG for interstate trucking, because the truck drivers can just stop at the truck stops, and you just need to have the CNG or LNG pumps at the truck stops. That's why the need to have infrastructure in place that you can use is why there's been so much attention turned to methanol. This is not a big deal. You got 3 pumps now with 87, 93, and 89 octane. The reason the 89 is there is for historical reasons. Every car on the road now can run on either 93 or 87. So you got a pump there at almost all filling stations that you may have to line the tank or something like that. But to be able to have a pump for methanol is really no big deal. I've gone into this with the relevant corporations at some length. I think the key thing also, by way of infrastructure, Wall Street is our financial infrastructure. And the international oil companies like Chevron and Exxon and BP and Shell don't really own oil anymore. They used to, but they have production sharing agreements. Exxon owns a little bit, but the oil is owned by the national oil companies like Kuwaiti Oil and Aramco and so on. And so if I would be absolutely certain that there would be a lot of lobbyists paid by the Gulf who would show up in full opposition to any ideas such as the ones just suggested. But as far as needing a market is concerned, that's the market of having new vehicles begin to be made so that they can drive on methanol for this paltry amount of money, and some cars modified, creates a vehicular market for natural gas and natural gas products like methanol, and that in turn will get probably the price of natural gas back up a bit and get people drilling more the way they were 2 or 3 years ago. There's quite a demand for finding a new market for natural gas, and automotive transportation is the one that clearly jumps out. I was down climbing around on fracking rigs in Louisiana a little over a year ago, and was talking to the county sheriff in this very poor parish was once poor in western Louisiana, and he said he'd been in office for 30 years. He said, "You know how many millionaires there were in this county 4 years ago?" I said, "No." He said, "1." He said, "You know how many there are now?" I said, "No." He said, 40 and climbing fast. So one thing that is happening is that there is, with natural gases being freed from the type of drilling limitations that existed before fracking and horizontal drilling were put together, there is a rather extraordinary opportunity, both from the point of view of people ready to increase the supply with leases and so forth, and from the point of view of demand. Obviously, you got to do the fracking right. You got to keep the methane contained. You can't let it leak. You got to put the concrete on right so it doesn't leak into people's wells. That is not a titanic problem. It is a necessary problem, but it's sort of as if we have a section of the surgeons in the country that know how to do appendectomies beginning to end just fine, and then a few surgeons who know how to do the cutting and taking out the appendix but aren't quite sure how to sew up the surgery and how to tie off veins and so forth. That's kind of what happened in Pennsylvania. You had people trying to drill and not knowing how to pour the concrete. They need some Texas and Oklahoma roughnecks up there to help them learn how to drill.
So, with all respect to Jim and Bob Zubrin, I have to say that I believe the methanol panacea, I think, is being dramatically exaggerated and seriously underestimates the costs of such a transition. So Jim casually said, well, you may have to line a tank or something in a gas station. How many gas stations did you say we have?
128,000.
128,000 gas stations have to, quote, line a tank or something, getting approval from their state and federal environmental authorities to put methanol, a colorless, odorless, toxic compound, into a tank, which is undoubtedly going to leak. We have I don't know how many thousands of brownfield gas stations we already have in this country where leaking tanks have contaminated the soil underneath the gas stations. I think it is truly trivializing the cost to simply hand wave and say, oh, you know, we just have to line a tank or something. And in fact, there are 64 separate more than 60 fuel blends in this country right now because of boutique fuel requirements at the EPA. Yes, there are 3 grades, but the blends are different. And that entire regulatory process would have to be revisited, and it's driven by the Clean Air Act. So this idea that, oh, we can just sort of, if only we had the will, we can just plow ahead into a methanol-powered future made from natural gas, I think is just extremely naive. And not really supportable by critical thought.
But we're talking a little bit about policy here. I mean, going back, if I may, to Rob. So if I'll follow on what you just said, so what you actually just said is the problem is that we have a regulatory scheme that prevents the market from working right now. Because if the regulation were so, you know, you can put let's assume we solve the Clean Air Act problem, but we can put everything here and it's clean. And there's no problem. We can actually do it. We don't need 50 regulation and changes. Then the market will take care of it.
Well, in fact, I mean, just one quick point, which is, in fact, right now, a significant part of gas prices is the boutique fuel requirements that fraction the market and lead to areas being locked into one refinery's run of a certain boutique fuel and unable to even go across the city, in some cases, to buy fuel from other filling stations. And so again, I mean, and no offense, but to say, well, we can fix the Clean Air Act thing.
No. You're saying what regulatory changes? This is the policy. You're saying we have a policy. We are suffering from high oil prices. What if they go to 200? Okay, so what are we going to do about it? How are we going to change it? So I'm asking for a solution. So he's saying it's easy to do natural gas. It's expensive. You're saying methanol is fine, but the regulatory problem is there. So maybe we should fix the regulatory problem. Rob, you're in Washington, Bloomberg Government.
Well, I mean, I think government trying to step in and shape outcomes is something that a lot of folks are thinking about. In the United States right now, if you look at existing infrastructure, for example, though, we have a number of flex fuel vehicles on the road in the U.S. GM's been selling them for a number of years now, and to some of the other manufacturers as well. And if you look at the amount of E85 sales, which is 85% ethanol, it's not terribly high. So even though we have existence of vehicles that could, in theory, run on a different kind of fuel, we're really not seeing folks put that into their tank. And I don't know if it's psychological reasons, fuel availability reasons, but the market certainly hasn't shown a big increase in E85 use, which is actually a pretty big deal for existing policy because we have the renewable fuel standard, which says we have to get a certain amount of ethanol used in transportation in the United States. And right now, everybody, when you're filling up your car, you're putting in about 10% of ethanol into your tank because most fuels are actually E10. And you can't go beyond that for normal cars. It's sort of this idea of a blend wall. And so to actually increase ethanol use in the United States, we've got to convince the people who have flex fuel vehicles to actually use it. I don't know if we need additional incentives or anything like that to make it happen, but we're not seeing it happen in the marketplace.
I know everybody wants to, and we can continue, and I can continue back and forth, but I promised the people in the room that will answer their question. You can sneak your answer for that. I know all of you will. So please, the lady right here. And wait just a second. We'll wait for the microphone, please.
Deborah Jacobson, George Washington University Law School. I wanted to ask a little bit about the Department of Defense policy. Department of Defense policy has been to use drop-in fuels, which I think are pretty much along the lines of your plug-and-play. You don't need new boats, new airplanes, and the like. And I think that you were critical, Ken, of the Department of Defense requirements, which are currently in debate right now. I'd like to hear Jim's view as to, I have a feeling he has a different view as to why those might be important.
The key thing is security, and some of the specialized fuels, for example, are produced at relatively few places, and it is such as the Navy's specialized diesel and aviation fuel, and it's important to be able to produce those where they're needed. Right now, we buy them inside the Straits of Hormuz. I'm sorry, essentially inside the Gulf, at Kuwait and elsewhere, and take them out into the Pacific and back to Hawaii and move them around. And you're under a lot of pressure if there should be hostilities in making sure you're getting not only your feedstock, but also some of these specialized fuels, as long as you have to stay with those. If you can use algae or sugar or other substances to produce a fuel for the military, particularly aviation fuel, which functions and can actually be utilized, you've got an awful lot more flexibility. Nobody who has ever worn a uniform would want to be in thrall to the supplies coming through the Persian Gulf or from the one or two other places where some of these specialized fuels are made. And I think that for anything related to the armed services, that ought to be the principal criteria. Some of these things are getting close in price to aviation fuel and so forth from from traditional sources.
Can I make a quick comment? So you have a choice. If you have these specialized fuels, you have a choice. You can either try to change the nature of the fuels to use algae fuels, which, by the way, as a biologist, I'm vaguely optimistic about the prospects for algae biofuels, but I think people are being a little excessively exuberant and thinking it's going to happen very soon. I review grants for EPA, and so I've seen the major research universities across the country submitting grants stating their current state of knowledge, and they are barely out of the womb when it comes to algae fuels. So the question is, if you have a really scarce fuel and you have a limited supply, you have a choice. You can either go to a more expensive fuel that you may not even be able to achieve your targets. We have a cellulosic fuel requirement in this country now. There's only one problem. We have no cellulosic ethanol, and we're actually making blenders pay fines because they're not using a fuel they can't buy, because the government, in its brilliance, deemed that it would be in existence by now, which is what the same thing they're trying to do with algae fuels. And so if you have a specific fuel need, you stockpile it, right? You stockpile that fuel. And we haven't had fuel interruptions of any significance to suggest that we're likely to have them. Let's not forget, as Jim actually pointed out, the Arab regimes, the oil exporters, have to sell their oil to maintain their social model, or they will collapse. They can't just they can't say, yeah, I'm not selling anymore. They can say, I won't sell directly to the United States, so fine, we buy it through somebody else. But these threats are overstated, and the answers are, I think, naive.
David Kreutzer from the Heritage Foundation. I don't understand the fascination and fixation on chicken and egg problems. Markets overcome them all the time. Trucks went from gasoline to diesel, with DVD players and DVDs and so on. But I'm more worried about this fixation on calling petroleum a monopoly fuel supply. All right, an analogy. 100% virtually of all ground transportation uses round wheels. The four-firm concentration ratio for tire manufacturers in the U.S. is much higher than the OPEC four-firm concentration ratio. What matters is, can we get the fuel from competitive suppliers? Only Saudi Arabia shows any inclination consistently to adjust production when prices change. All the other OPEC members produce full speed all the time, and they look like a cartel when spare capacity drops. So the question is, why do we really consider OPEC a cartel when there's only one firm that acts like a monopolist?
Anybody?
Yeah, okay. Anybody other than me?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, we'll
I
go
think,
first if you want.
I think you make very good points. If you actually look at the empirical data as to whether or not OPEC has successfully controlled price, it's not there. They have not shown success at setting the world oil price. They cheat. This is the thing with nasty regimes, is they cheat on each other. So when they impose, quota production targets, a lot of them cheat and produce anyway. And so I think you're right. It's, people think about these things superficially, and the assumption that we have a monopolistic market doesn't make sense. And yeah, I agree.
I'm going to have so much fun. This old Scoop Jackson Democrat is going to have so much fun in the weeks to come explaining how from AEI I was getting a defense of the permanence of regulatory restrictions as to why we can't break a cartel. And from Heritage, I was getting a hymn of praise to OPEC. I just love it. I absolutely love it. You gotta love it. You're saying they're sweet.
I want to
And I'm not
comment.
in
I want
favor
to
of
comment
maintaining
on that.
regulations either.
I think the question is we already answered, but in a different way. It's a question: do we know if we have a cartel in paper or not? Nobody knows. You know why? Because it doesn't cost much. The reason we care about oil because it costs so much and affects our life so much. That's why we care. Okay.
Exactly.
There may be tons of other cartels around us, okay, that we don't even know about or don't care about.
The analogy.
I think it's the money.
Yeah, so
And I'm not going to go into whether they are cartel or not. It's how much it affects our life.
The great analogy is Annie Coren's and Gal Luft's to salt. Salt was a strategic commodity, as is oil, for thousands of years. Roman soldiers paid in salt. Word salary comes from salt. If you had a salt mine, your neighbor didn't. You lorded it over him. You were in the countries into war over salt mines in the Caribbean until the middle of the late 19th century. Electricity and refrigeration destroyed salt as a strategic commodity. It broke up salt's monopoly. It did not ruin salt totally. We still use a lot of salt for a lot of purposes. There are markets in it. It's not that it's useless. But people who controlled it had power then. And if you talk to anybody in the Gulf area who has a allegiance to one of those oil states and say, as I have, I really do think we need to do what I described here, what he'll say is, you're trying to destroy my country. You realize that? You're trying to destroy my country. What I say is, no, we don't want to destroy you. We just want you to get work.
Please, right here.
Joe Cannon from the Fuel Freedom Foundation, and I think a friend of Ken's, and I want to say, forget about the monopoly. Forget about whether there's a monopoly, a cartel, or anything. You do have one product in the market, which over a long period of time has been a pretty terrific product, okay? And as Yossi just said, it really what matters is, and well, you said it too, the problem isn't that there's oil, that there's a monopoly. The problem is that spikes in oil, over which we have little or zero control, have a dramatic, devastating effect on our economy. So forget about the monopoly part of it. I guess I'm astonished to hear you say, and to pick up a little bit on Jim's point, you have written tens, hundreds, millions of words about the adverse effects of environmental EPA regulation on the economy. And it seems to me your chief response here is, well, there's this regulatory impediment.
No.
But let me just finish. I'm sorry. Let me just finish a little bit here. What if you could make it? What if you could if you could get through the EPA regulatory? Let the market figure out. People will figure out how to build gasoline stations cheaper and faster. Walmart tomorrow could solve this problem. Safeway could solve this problem. There are a lot of ways that this problem could be solved. The only thing between you and $2 a gallon methanol right now is a regulation.
And the lack of a car. I don't have a car.
No, but you can get, well,
so-
okay.
so-
Okay. But you could get a car.
Since that was addressed directly to me, though, I'd like to answer
You
it
and then
real quick. You're right. I have an extensive catalog of publications criticizing our regulatory apparatus, and of course, I was not in any way suggesting that we maintain it as it is or that we not make attempts to reform it. What I was saying was that the simple, casual, we can do this easily thing is naive. We haven't managed to adjust the EPA in a positive way or the Clean Air Act in a positive way in 30 years. Politicians have shown absolutely no stomach for it. It's a massive hurdle. It is not a trivial, we can just, a little bit. I'd be perfectly happy to amend the regulatory apparatus of the United States to radically streamline it and simplify it. I don't think every single car should have to be approved by the EPA and technology certified by various forms of the government with regard to its fuels and everything, or have its mileage determined in EPA standardized tests and have to meet fleet fuel economy standards. What I'm saying is that it's naive to think these are simple problems. These are monstrously complex, knotted problems.
I would say to Ken that, as Mr. Kennedy once said to Mr. Nixon in a debate, I don't recognize myself as the straw man the gentleman wants to fight against. I don't believe that it is naive to point out the difference between infrastructure changes that are required in order to operate a car on methanol, even less on butanol, which will be the next one coming along because it's true drop-in. The comparative ease of being able to operate cars that exist today after modification, new cars even more easily, and make relatively modest changes to filling stations or have new ones added in Walmart and so forth, compared with what everybody else has been talking about. Remember the hydrogen highway, or in California, I guess it was the hydrogen highway. Remember the hydrogen highway?
That is a terrible impersonation.
All of these proposals have blinked at the issue of infrastructure. So to point out that the infrastructure changes for methanol are considerably simpler than virtually any of these others seems to me not to be naive, just to be accurate. And the only reason to oppose this, as far as I'm concerned, is either that you don't like competition, you don't like markets, or you like oil. Those are the only things I can think of that would lead you to take the stand, Ken, that you don't want competition in the fuel market.
As John Kennedy told Richard Nixon, I don't think I resemble the straw man you just put forward. And speaking as a Californian, you should avoid the impersonations of Arnold Schwarzenegger, or he might pick you up and throw you in a trash can.
Rob? Okay, please, who has the speaker, right?
Matthew Sada, I'm with the State Department, and I have a two-part question. The first is that everyone is talking about nationwide deployment, 120,000 gas stations, et cetera. What is there to speak of, regional, geographically concentrated deployment as opposed to this whole nationwide problem that we have to tackle at once? And the second thing is, how do we get there? How do we transition? To pay for these modifications required, whether it's at the gas station, whether it's on the car vehicles themselves. And you've spoken about, gas at a historical low, $2 cubic foot. Is there a possibility for taxation that could pay for the transition costs to allow that transfer to take place, and then you'd have a market to use the gas?
You want to take that first?
Sure, I'll take it first. I mean, I think that whenever you think about how the government intervenes in this stuff, I mean, you could have a federal approach, you could have state approaches. I mean, look at where all the Chevy Volts are selling. I mean, they're already selling in localized markets. They're here in D.C., Northeast, California. So, I mean, I think in a lot of ways we're already seeing some regionalization in how folks buy vehicles, and there's incentives in different states that push these vehicles. But I mean, none of this is free from the government's perspective, ultimately. So you got to find sources of funding to say we want to push these kinds of things. Because, right, we have the market outcome now, which is not any of these things. So if you want to encourage them from the government, you've got to have maybe tax credits. Right now you get $7,500 if you buy a Volt or a Leaf by Nissan. I don't think there's a similar tax credit for a CNG vehicle or a methanol vehicle.
California has some.
But not at the federal level.
No, not
so
federally, no.
I mean, it only comes in and saying, folks from Congress have to step in and say, these are things we want to support, and find the appropriate level of incentive and find the appropriate source of funding to do it.
I think it's pretty straightforward. The flex fuel bill that is kicking around now would simply require on a schedule that cars be able to use more than one fuel. So if you've got a diesel that can also use biodiesel, fine. If you've got as I do, you've got an electric vehicle that also uses gasoline, like a Volt or a plug-in hybrid, that's fine. You do want cars that are able to use methanol, and a lot of them, I think, since it's relatively simple, would be constructed that way. But the point is, you don't have to choose. You don't have a pace at which it has to go national because you're still driving on gasoline. It's not like changing to natural gas and you have to have your whole engine and storage redone. You can go back and forth between methanol and natural gas, the way you can go back, or gasoline, the way you can go back and forth between ethanol and gasoline. And it's that relative simplicity of introduction together with the relatively small scale of the changes that are needed in the infrastructure that seems to meet them. And I really do think butanol will probably be coming along a lot faster, and before too many years are up, we'll be seeing that. And that is a complete drop-in fuel, same energy, et cetera, as gasoline, and very, I think, very promising.
As Rob pointed out, I mean, we have right now the market outcome. I think as Mercedes-Benz is now reconsidering rolling out an electric vehicle entirely because their field testing says there's no market for them. The sales of the Volt and Leaf are radically lower than the government was predicting and expecting because consumer demand is low. The vehicles are almost twice as expensive as a competitive internal combustion engine for their performance. there's an insurance premium, there's a repair premium, there's a performance deficit. You know, these things are complicated, and markets are the best way to work them out. I don't know why in the United States we're still having this discussion of should the government intervene in energy markets to tell us which kind of fuel we're supposed to use, or should you have markets try to allocate the resource the most efficiently, and competition within the country to keep price as low as it can be. It seems to me to be a strange conversation.
Please.
Hello, my name is Park McGraw with Physical Science. I'm kind of curious. The conversation today is limited to such a time frame. I was watching a Robert Vaughn movie that was made in the early 80s. A couple weeks ago, they were discussing solar power in the movie. That's 30 years ago. It took about 100 years for the 100,000 gas stations to be implemented into the United States here. Most of that was inspired with the interstate system. The infrastructure wasn't inlaid. It wasn't like Las Vegas, build it and they will come. Okay, and so now I'm looking at this time frame. We got a 100-year time frame. Shouldn't we be a little less short-sighted and look at centennial solutions? Because burning of the carbon-based fuels, isn't going to last for much longer than 100 years. Now we've consumed 30 years just in our simple discussion. Well, easily obtainable. Let's put it that way, without incurring great costs onto society. We need something that. And you know, everything we're looking at right now is going to.
So the question is why is short range and not a long range?
Yes. Why are we not looking at centennial solutions?
Let's run it by.
Well,
everybody.
I mean, I think in my opening remarks, I concluded that you really have to think about these things in terms of decades and generations. But I think the problem for the government, when you look at it, is sure, 100 years from now, I think our fueling infrastructure will look very, very different. And I think from a policymaker standpoint, you look at it and say, well, what can you do today? What's the appropriate push or pull in the right direction? I mean, I think we're here today because the sentiment is that you know, the free market isn't producing some of the investment in alternatives that folks would like to see, and so I think there are questions well, is the right answer basic R&D? Is it actually putting things in the marketplace today? And it's a very good debate. I don't personally know the answer, but I do think you should have a very long-term view, and probably any of these things where you try to pick a winner in the near term, you could easily pick the wrong one.
Since I quoted Friedman, Hayek, and Adam Smith, I suppose I could also quote John Maynard Keynes, which is that in the long run we're all dead. So sooner is getting started in a way that doesn't interfere with more positive changes later is a very good idea. And just to use an example, if you start now with methanol, make it available, not tell people they have to use it, but make it available, I think its lower price will attract a lot of people into that market. That has everything you need in order to switch when it comes out to butanol, which has the same energy density as gasoline and is superior to methanol. So what you want to do is continue, I think, to make changes which lay the groundwork for later changes, but don't have you sit on your hands for a couple of decades and spend $1 trillion the way the hydrogen highway would have had us do.
Well, not to be out Hayek'd, let us keep in mind that Hayek's book was titled The Fatal Conceit. And it specifically points out that governments are not able to make predictions of future markets in any successful way. The belief that they can is what underlies massive government failed interventions. And in fact, we can no more conceive of what markets will look like in 100 years than someone in 1910 would have been able to conceive of an iPad. All we can know is that if we keep two dynamic markets, we will achieve the movement between here and 2112 as efficiently as we possibly can.
I just want to add, the question is, do we have time or not? You said we have fossil fuel for X number of years. There's a recent IMF report that came, a working paper that came recently that said they believe, based on all indication, I don't know if they're right, okay, but that oil prices will double this decade. And they say what it will do to world economy, they use the word convex. I don't know what that means, but it's really bad. Please.
Chris Keith. I'm in the U.S. Navy, also moonlight as an entrepreneur. I helped start an iPad manufacturing case company last year. So from a VC and funding standpoint, say as an entrepreneur, I'm interested in natural gas and the benefits, but what is as a VC, not super interested in being first into the technology. What's my incentive to jump in and be the first person to take the plunge? And then secondly, what is the effect on the manufacturing industry, the petroleum-based products, with this whole discussion? I haven't really heard anything about that. How does that play into the discussion as well?
I'll take the second one if you want.
I'll take the, I mean, I'll take the first one when you're done.
You are starting to see already a beginning of a shift toward natural gas as a feedstock for industrial chemicals. If you can break natural gas down, well, it's not breaking down because you're going from one carbon molecule to two, but if you can cheaply and affordably produce ethylene from it, it is quite plausible to use ethylene with existing technologies to be a building block for other fuels and other chemicals. And so one of the things to watch as an investor is what of these new technologies produce the intermediate steps that are necessary to go further, because you may, if it's something, it's kind of classic, but if it's something that everybody needs no matter which solution they're taking, that's one thing to keep your eye on. I think there is a very substantial opportunity for the chemical companies, and you're starting to see it in their investment and so forth, to start moving away from oil to gas, even if gas is only 5 times cheaper than oil instead of 10 times cheaper.
Two quick comments. First of all, it's not clear to me that we're lacking in venture capital in the field. Look at the rate at which shale gas is expanding. That the money to drill these wells isn't coming, right? Is coming from somewhere. It's probably coming from venture capital firms. Exxon has dropped, I think, $600 million in research funding into algae biofuels. So it's not clear to me that venture capital is not investing in the most promising areas. As for chemical manufacturing, we've made all of the United States produces its chemicals from natural gas and has for quite a long time. For regular air pollution reasons, we build chemicals up from natural gas. Europe and other countries crack chemicals down from oil. Yes, we are having a renaissance in chemical manufacturing in the United States previously because the price is low here, natural gas price is low, so the chemical manufacturers are coming back, whereas they had moved a lot of their plants to be closer to their supply, which was more in the Middle East. So.
Rob, any other comment?
Yeah, thanks, Josie. I want to thank everybody here today. I know that there are more questions and comments, but we will be posting the transcript of today's discussion online at ourenergypolicy.org by next week, and I'd urge all of you to get on and continue the discussion. I don't think anything really illustrates better than the kind of discussion we heard today what we are trying to do at ourenergypolicy.org, which is to create a nonpartisan platform for people with different views to engage and really create a discussion that hopefully can lead to sounder policy as we go forward. So thanks to all of you for coming. I really particularly want to thank our panelists. I'd like to ask everybody to give them a hand, and Yossi. If anybody has any questions, we have people will stay here as well. Yeah, feel free to come up. And from ourenergypolicy.org, Matt Jordan at the back of the room, and Mike next to him, and Dan over here, if you have questions, please ask them. Thanks again.